There was an odd phenomena in the debate. There was an attempt to fill a vacuum with nothing. What we saw was an absence of policy substance and an avoidance of the true issues that are plaguing the country even right now. What we've heard is there's no plan for the nation, particularly those who find themselves at the bottom and continually under assault by the mechanisms of government. And there's no more profound example of that than what we're seeing in terms of incidences of police violence across the country. In Louisville, Kentucky, we're dealing with the aftermath of Breonna Taylor's death and this argument about whether or not a bad search warrant that leads to a bad execution somehow becomes the problem of the victim and not an issue of the system. And so the president had no answers for that. The president had no answers for how do you deal with the dismantling of systemic racism. Why? Because the president doesn't believe that systemic racism exists. And even in the midst of all of that, what we see is on yesterday, the Judiciary Committee of the Senate moved to a floor vote the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who will not take a position on super precedents, but holds to this archaic doctrine of originalism that was actually only created in the 1980s. And how that all comes together in this season where millions of people are across the country standing up for their right to the franchise. Is you have a court that has been hostile to voter expansion and an agent of voter suppression when the issues at play are actually the issues that affect everyday people. Here are some of the issues that we get from the Breonna Taylor case. What happens when the prosecutor, who's designated the special prosecutor, gives incomplete evidence that does not lead to a full weighing of all of the factors by a grand jury? Basically, it nullifies the meaning and the power of the grand jury, and it leads to the manipulation of citizens who need to have some say on those who actually protect their interest and their rights. We recognize from last night, if we don't come away with anything else, that elections do have consequences. And we are living under the consequences of an election 4 years ago and with an effort to try to reenact this same play for 4 more years. We cannot go through 4 more days, much less 4 more years of the hostility of a federal government that acts against the interests of the people and reinforces hostility toward Black and brown communities. If you can endorse the Proud Boys and protect bad policing, then obviously that's a sign that there's something at play and it requires the intervention of the people themselves. And so here's what I think Reverend Jackson would have us to remember is that the voices of the people are the voices that matter. And what we saw last night is that there's one of the 2 candidates that spoke to the issues that are affecting the people down to their actual lives. And there's another voice that has been silent, just assuming that the problems that affect the people will just magically go away. This is an important election. And as we continue to talk about the issues, we want to highlight the areas where we recognize this president has had no plan, and what plans he has put in place have been actually hostile to the people.
The commentators started the discussion by introducing to the audience, the listening audience, and the presidential candidates that on this evening, and I quote, "On this evening, we are here to address 6 major topics." And I made the fundamental assumption that one of those topics would actually be education. And it was not. We find that problematic in nature. America is experiencing a low literacy crisis. Research tells us that if a child is not reading at or above 3rd grade, by the time he or she reaches that grade level, they are highly likely to struggle throughout their entire academic career. And yet the 6 major topics that were scheduled to be addressed during the presidential debate last night neglected to address this issue. In addition to that, when young children matriculate through school systems and their low literacy levels are at a high, right? The next thing that happens is that they become adults with low literacy. And adults with low literacy skills and abilities have a hard time getting a job when they are available. Adults with low literacy skills, if they do get a job, have a hard time maintaining it. Illiteracy at the adult level increases the likelihood that the adult will be incarcerated and experience health-related issues. It is problematic in nature. And so there remains a need for an education agenda to actually be established and articulated. In addition to that, during this period of COVID-19, the inequities that exist in America's schools became more apparent than ever. There remains a need for an agenda at the national level to exist, to do more than just say we want to address the inequities that exist in our schools, but the development of a comprehensive plan of action that is then backed by the development and implementation of policies designed for the very specific purpose of addressing low literacy in America. And lastly, the most important appointment that can be made after the president is selected and elected is that of Secretary of Education for the United States of America. He or she must be grounded in social justice theory and from a practical perspective, and he or she must be able to propose policies that move us closer to addressing the social justice issues that impact our students so that they are equipped with the skills, the intellect, and the capabilities to positively address the impacts of negative things that are occurring within their communities.
As you can hear from all of the speakers, there is an urgency in this moment. This is not merely a who election, it's a what election. There are a number of things that have been left off of the agenda of the United States government for almost 4 years now. Education, civil and human rights, labor issues, an international agenda that is comprehensive and not isolationist. And in this moment, we've got to decide, will our agenda issues be first and foremost in our minds sufficiently to go to the polls in large numbers? We know that there's an absolute onslaught from state Republican parties against the efforts to expand access to the franchise. But it means between now and November 3rd, everybody, regardless of where you live, needs to be a part of this process of determining what will be on the agenda for the next 4 years. Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson has been intentional about making sure that any agenda is comprehensive and holistic, and it speaks to the issues that go from the bottom up and not simply from the top down. That is our priority, and Dr. King talked about the fierce urgency of now. Now is every day between today and November 3rd, ready to handle the business of what comes next in America and for the world.